To all those people watching, I like to remind everyone that this video is not made for kids. It's for older fans and adults. Enjoy the fucking video!
Usually during the cooler months, the clay pits are often less busy. But this year, there was a big order to deliver, and lots of trucks were lined up in the yards ready to be taken to the harbour on Edward's branch line. Bill and Ben, the tank engine twins, would usually do the run, and along the way they would whistle at the little crossing that crosses the country lane to warn people that they are coming, as it's regulations. But one day the twins met their match. Across the field from the crossing lives a cottage that was recently owned by a woman named Mrs. Tibbs. She used to live in Tidmouth, but found it so noisy and very busy recently and wants to get away from the hustle and bustle. "What on earth?" she gasped. "I was trying to get away from the noise," she groaned, "not to move to it." Throughout the day, the twins puffed up and down the line, blowing their whistles at the crossing. "Coming through," they peeped. But then they saw Mrs. Tibbs running down the field. But she wasn't trying to catch up to them and wave. They saw that she was shaking her fist instead. "Be quiet!" she shouted. "Some of us wanted peace and quiet!" Bill and Ben were surprised.
Hello everybody! Welcome to the island of Sodor.
Back at the clay pits, the twins were coupled up to the next line of trucks. They were still surprised by Mrs. Tibbs shouting at them to be quiet. "Did you see that woman shouting at us, Ben?" asked Bill. "Yeah, what's with her?" agreed Ben. "She's telling us to be quiet, but she's going shouting a mouthful at us. Why couldn't she take her own words?" They were amused by this and carried on working. But every time they whistled at the level crossing, Mrs. Tibbs would still shout and complain about the noise they were making. "You noisy great engine!" she shouted. "What is the regulations, Mom?" replied Bill. But there was no use. Mrs. Tibbs was still shouting and berating the twins wherever they passed. Then they decided to tease her by blowing their whistles as loud and as long as they liked. This annoyed Mrs. Tibbs even further. "Stop that! Be quiet!" she snapped. "Stop that! Be quiet!" mocked the twins as they blew their whistles. They carried on with their trick for days upon days upon days. "Stop that! You're disturbing the peace!" "Stop that! You're disturbing the peace!" mocked the twins. They were enjoying themselves, riling up Mrs. Tibbs. That was until they began to feel tired of it all, as Mrs. Tibbs was still complaining about the noise. They parked their trucks at the harbour and were getting annoyed by her. "As soon as we're near that little crossing, we're going to see her having a fit again," groused Bill. "Well then I'll say this," replied Ben. "We'll just whistle as much as we can. It's part of the rules that we have to warn people that we're coming," and even their crews agreed to them as well. Mrs. Tibbs was soon attending her garden. "So nice, so peaceful," she sighed happily. Mrs. Tibbs was shocked by the noise, and then she said, "Oh great, it's those things!" She ran towards them, but because they were whistling loud and long, it was hard enough for Mrs. Tibbs to hear herself, and she covered her ears. The twins kept on whistling as soon as they went over the crossing, and as they were done they cried out, "It's regulations!" and they stormed off. Finally, Mrs. Tibbs had had enough. "If those yellow pests can't respect my peace and quiet, then I'll make them," she said. The next day the twins were to make their final deliveries for the day. As Bill and Ben made their way towards the level crossing, they blew their whistles as usual. Then Bill saw a person up ahead and cried, "Stop!" His driver saw it too, as well as Ben's, and the two engines applied their brakes. Standing on the level crossing was Mrs. Tibbs with a red flag. Everyone was surprised and cross. "What do you think you're doing?" retorted Bill. "Do you realise what danger you put yourself into?" But Mrs. Tibbs didn't listen to Bill's retort and instead walked towards his cab. She climbed up and started to shout at the driver and fireman all about the noise and the disturbance that the twins had caused to her. Her words were loud and clear, and some weren't too pleasing to hear. Bill and Ben's crews tried their best to reason with Mrs. Tibbs, but she was stubborn and rude. "Why can't you treat this old woman with some respect?" she said. "I came here to have some peace." "If you wanted peace, Mom, then you should have moved to a house away from the railway line. Our line was here first, and your house came second. We have every right to whistle here because it's the rules," said Ben. "Oh, pooh to your rules," retorted Mrs. Tibbs. "Surely you could whistle someplace else instead of near my house." Bill, Ben and their crews couldn't believe the ignorance coming from her. "Surely, Mom," replied Bill crossly. He almost shrieked. "You heard of a railway before, right?" Everyone began to argue with her, but they all had forgotten one thing. The twins had stopped on a level crossing, and when a level crossing is blocked by an engine in their train, no cars, buses or lorries can get through. Soon traffic started to build up on the country lane and they were getting impatient. "Hey, come on," they shouted, "we need to get through." But no one replied and they began to honk their horns. "Oh, shut up!" snapped Mrs. Tibbs crossly, and she continued on arguing with Bill, Ben and their crews. One of the drivers just had enough and got his smartphone. Soon his call came through to the manageress, Mrs. Fibonacci. "Hello?" she asked. Then she heard about the problem. "I'll see to it. Thank you for calling." Mrs. Tibbs was not letting down a fair fight. She kept on berating them and telling them off that everyone was starting to get tired of it all. At last the manageress came to the scene. "Bill and Ben," said the manageress, "please move back so the road vehicles can get through." "Road vehicles?" they said, and they finally saw the commotion that they and Mrs. Tibbs had caused. "Oh dear," they murmured, and they backed away. Now, care to explain one at a time, please, on what was going on? And so they did. And while on some occasion one or the other would talk on top of each other, Mrs. Fibonacci soon got the clear picture. "Now then, while I understand, Mrs. Tibbs, you came here to have some peace and quiet, I will say Bill and Ben had every right here. Mine and Sir Topham Hatt's engines have to whistle at crossings and tunnels to warn people that they're approaching. If they don't, then you wouldn't be standing here today. As for you," she continued as she turned towards the twins, "you caused an escalation, Mrs. Tibbs, that led to this mess in the first place. There was no need to deliberately annoy her, and that goes to your crews as well." "Yes, Ma'am," they replied. "Now then, since the traffic is cleared, I want you to take the china clay now and come straight back for more." "Yes, Ma'am," replied the twins. "And I hope you understand to be more patient, Mrs. Tibbs," added Mrs. Fibonacci. Bill, Ben, their crews, and Mrs. Tibbs took those words to heart and started to respect each other. And from that day on, whenever the twins make their way to the crossing, they whistled and also gave a special peep to Mrs. Tibbs, who smiled and waved. She's used to the noise now, and when Bill and Ben went to Tidmouth, she felt it was too quiet without them in the background and began to miss them. But she knew that they won't be gone for long, and she looks forward to seeing them again in the new year.